For generations, the rifle stood at the center of warfare. It was the soldier's constant companion, the instrument through which courage was measured and survival earned. Military doctrine revolved around it. Training manuals praised marksmanship. Nations built myths around the lone infantryman, advancing under fire, rifle in hand, deciding battles one shot at a time. In the early years of the Second World War, few questioned this assumption. Combat, it was believed, remained a contest of vision, nerve, and direct engagement. But war has a habit of changing faster than belief. As battlefields grew more complex, another form of violence quietly expanded its influence in direct fire. Mortars, squat and unremarkable in appearance, did not ask soldiers to see their enemy. They did not require heroism in the traditional sense. Instead, they arced destruction through the air, landing behind walls, inside trenches, and among men who never heard the shot that killed them. Their effect was less personal, but far more decisive. American forces learned this lesson gradually and often painfully. In North Africa and Italy, infantry units advanced against German positions carved into hillsides and reinforced with machine guns and concrete. Rifle fire proved precise but insufficient. Even well-aimed bullets could not dislodge an enemy that refused to expose itself. Progress slowed to yards per day. Casualties accumulated. Commanders began to understand that accuracy alone could not overcome preparation. The German army, for its part, trusted deeply in defense. Its doctrine emphasized fortified lines, overlapping fields of fire, and depth. German soldiers were trained to endure bombardment and wait out frontal assaults. Against rifles, these positions were resilient. Against something else, they were vulnerable in ways not immediately apparent. That something else was the mortar. Lighter than artillery, faster to deploy, and carried forward with the infantry itself, American mortars began to reshape engagements. A small team could set one up in minutes. Coordinates could be estimated. Fire could be adjusted shot by shot. And when the rounds fell, they arrived almost without warning, descending vertically into spaces no rifle could reach. Surprise became the mortar's greatest strength. German defenders, conditioned to expect incoming fire from the front, suddenly found death arriving from above. Trenches became traps. Cover became confinement. Entire positions could be neutralized without a single rifleman seeing his target. By the later stages of the war, the arithmetic of killing had shifted. Rifles still mattered, but mortars inflicted more casualties, suppressed more movement, and decided more outcomes. Quietly, without ceremony, they eclipsed the weapon that once defined the battlefield. And while soldiers focused on what was falling from the sky, few noticed how rapidly the doctrine behind it was evolving somewhere far from the front, where planners were already asking how much further this unseen advantage could be pushed. The mortar was not a new invention when the Second World War began. Its lineage stretched back to the trench stalemates of the First World War, where crude tubes hurled explosives in steep arcs over mud and wire. Those early weapons were improvised answers to immobility. Yet in the years between wars, as armies studied what had failed and what had endured, the mortar quietly transformed. It became lighter, more precise, and far more reliable. What had once been a stopgap evolved into a system. The United States paid particular attention to this evolution. American planners understood geography in a way shaped by distance and mobility. They expected war to be fought across oceans, mountains, and broken ground. Heavy artillery could not always follow. Rifles could not always decide. What was needed was a weapon that moved with the infantry, one that could be carried, assembled, fired, and displaced in minutes. The answer was a new generation of mortars designed for speed rather than permanence. Unlike rifles, mortars asked nothing of visibility. Crews did not need to see their enemy, only to understand the land between them. From behind hedgerows, from reverse slopes, from shallow depressions in the earth, mortar teams delivered violence indirectly and efficiently. The shell's high trajectory bypassed walls, bunkers, and trenches, the very features meant to protect those inside. In this, the mortar addressed the central problem of modern defense without confronting it head-on. Two weapons came to define this approach: the 60 mm and the 81 mm mortars. Light enough to be broken down and carried by a small team, powerful enough to suppress entire positions, they struck a careful balance. Range, portability, and lethality were no longer competing priorities. They were combined into a single tool, issued not sparingly, but widely. To support this shift, the U.S. Army rewrote its thinking. New field manuals trained mortar crews to calculate distances quickly, to read terrain instinctively, and to adjust fire under pressure. Mathematics replaced marksmanship. Coordination replaced individual aim. It was a quiet, doctrinal revolution. German forces, steeped in the logic of fixed defenses and disciplined endurance, were slower to recognize what this mobility meant. Their positions were strong, but increasingly exposed from above, and without warning. As American units pushed deeper into Europe, the demand for immediate, flexible fire support only grew. Mortars answered that demand again and again. And with each advance, a question emerged that few had fully considered. If indirect fire could move this fast, how far could it go before it reshaped the battlefield entirely? For centuries, the rifle represented control. It rewarded patience, discipline, and individual skill. A trained infantryman could choose his target, adjust his aim, and decide when to fire. In theory, this precision defined superiority on the battlefield. But the conditions of modern war steadily eroded that advantage. As defenses hardened and terrain grew more complex, precision alone became a limitation rather than a strength. Rifles demanded exposure. To fire, a soldier had to see his enemy, and to see his enemy, he often had to be seen himself. This requirement narrowed the rifle's usefulness. Targets behind walls, inside bunkers, or dug deep into reverse slopes remained untouched. Entire defensive systems could sit just beyond the reach of direct fire, impervious to even the most disciplined marksman. Mortars altered that equation completely. Their shells did not travel in straight lines, and their crews did not require a clear view of the enemy. Fired in high arcs, mortar rounds descended into spaces rifles could never threaten. Trenches designed for horizontal fire became funnels. Cover became vulnerability. The battlefield itself, its folds, ridges, and depressions, was turned into an ally rather than an obstacle. The effect was not only physical, but psychological. Rifle fire was expected. It cracked and snapped with a rhythm soldiers learned to endure. Mortar fire, by contrast, arrived irregularly and without warning. A brief thump in the distance, a pause measured in seconds, and then sudden impact. German troops described the waiting as worse than the explosion itself. There was no target to shoot back at, no direction to charge, only uncertainty. For German defenders, this created a siege mentality, even in open terrain. Positions that had held for days against rifle assaults could be neutralized in minutes once mortar fire was brought to bear. Casualties mounted not just from shrapnel, but from disorientation and suppressed movement. Command and control frayed under constant bombardment from unseen sources. American units learned to exploit this imbalance. Mortar teams worked closely with advancing infantry, lifting fire just long enough for movement, then returning it with precision measured in yards rather than inches. Obstacles were cleared, resistance softened, and momentum maintained. Gradually, a shift took place. Rifles remained necessary but no longer decisive. The task of breaking defenses passed to weapons that did not need to see their enemy to defeat them. And as this balance changed, commanders began to ask what would happen when mortars were no longer merely supporting the advance, but shaping it from the very beginning. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, the problem facing Allied planners was not courage nor numbers, but suppression. The beaches of Normandy were overlooked by concrete, steel, and carefully sighted machine guns. German strongpoints were designed to survive bombardment and punish exposure. Rifles alone could not solve this problem. Men pinned on open sand needed the enemy's heads forced down, not precisely targeted. Mortars were tasked with that grim responsibility. As landing craft touched shore, mortar fire followed close behind. Often assembled under fire, sometimes operated from shallow craters or behind wrecked vehicles, American mortar teams began firing within minutes of landing. Their targets were not individual soldiers, but systems, machine gun nests embedded in bluffs, trench lines hidden from direct view, bunkers whose firing slits could not be reached by small arms. Mortar rounds dropped behind embrasures and into communication trenches, collapsing the logic of German defense piece by piece. German forces were unprepared for this kind of pressure. Their doctrine assumed artillery would come from identifiable batteries, rifles from visible attackers. Mortars confounded both expectations. They were mobile, dispersed, and difficult to locate. Even as German artillery attempted to respond, the targets had already shifted. Mortar teams fired, displaced, and fired again, exploiting confusion faster than it could be corrected. These effects accumulated rapidly. On beaches where rifle fire had stalled assaults, mortar bombardment created brief but critical openings. German gunners abandoned positions under indirect fire. Survivors retreated deeper into bunkers, sacrificing observation for survival. In those moments, infantry moved sometimes only yards, sometimes enough to change the outcome of the landing. The psychological toll was equally decisive. Mortar fire lacked rhythm. It arrived unevenly, unpredictably, denying defenders the comfort of pattern. Orders went unheard. Signals were missed. Units that had trained to repel frontal assaults found themselves isolated, under pressure from an enemy they could not see. Along the beaches, mortar teams worked in close coordination with rifle squads, adjusting fire based on shouted distances and hand signals. Their mobility allowed them to respond where resistance stiffened, turning local crises into manageable problems. Progress was slow, costly, and uneven, but it was progress. By the end of the day, the beachheads held. Normandy was not won by mortars alone, but without them, it might not have been won at all. Indirect fire had proven it could break the strongest defenses at the most critical moment. And as Allied forces pushed inland, the lessons of the beaches followed refined, repeated, and scaled, suggesting that what worked under the worst conditions imaginable could shape every battle yet to come. By December 1944, the war in Europe appeared decided. Allied armies pressed eastward, German resources were strained, and the momentum seemed irreversible. It was then, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that the German army struck back. The counteroffensive was sudden, violent, and calculated to exploit weather, terrain, and surprise. For American units caught along the front, it became a fight not for ground, but for survival. Winter stripped the battlefield of visibility. Snow muffled movement. Fog swallowed distances. Rifles, dependent on sight and steady exposure, lost much of their effectiveness. Engagements dissolved into confusion at close range, often decided before targets were clearly identified. In these conditions, the limitations of traditional infantry weapons became unmistakable. Mortars filled the void. Their crews worked in silence, broken only by the dull thump of firing pins and the distant echo of impact. In dense forests where lines of sight collapsed to a few yards, mortars did not require clarity, only coordinates and timing. American units leaned heavily on indirect fire to disrupt German advances moving through tree lines and frozen draws. German troops, advancing under cover of terrain and weather, found themselves under constant pressure. Mortar rounds fell from unseen positions, scattering formations and shattering cohesion. Defensive positions, hastily prepared in snow and ice, offered little protection against shells descending from above. There was no clear front. No obvious direction of attack, only sustained bombardment that denied rest and order. As the offensive slowed, mortars became tools not only of defense, but of reversal. German units attempting to regroup were met with concentrated fire that broke their momentum. Attacks stalled before they fully formed. The element of surprise, once held by the attackers, was steadily eroded by persistent indirect fire that punished movement and exposed command nodes. For American infantry, often outnumbered and undersupplied, the mortar became a lifeline. It compensated for thin lines and limited reserves. It bought time. It allowed small units to hold ground far longer than doctrine predicted. In frozen foxholes, soldiers listened for the reassuring sound of outgoing fire, knowing that help did not need to be seen to be felt. When the German advance finally collapsed, it did so not with a single decisive blow, but through accumulated failure. Mortars had played their part quietly, relentlessly, denying the enemy the initiative at the moment it mattered most. The Ardennes offered a final lesson written in snow and steel. In modern war, adaptability outweighed tradition. And as the guns fell silent, one truth stood clear. Battlefields would never again belong to the weapon that demanded visibility alone. As the war moved from set-piece battles to fluid, unpredictable engagements, American soldiers learned that doctrine alone was insufficient. The mortar, already proven effective, became a platform for improvisation. Crews experimented constantly, adapting techniques to meet conditions no manual had anticipated. In the field, necessity replaced theory, and innovation followed. Mortars were fired from places never intended by their designers. Crews mounted tubes on half-tracks and jeeps to provide immediate fire support during rapid advances. In urban fighting, rounds were lobbed from courtyards, alleyways, and the shadows of ruined buildings. Elevation was adjusted to clear rooftops. Distances were estimated by eye. The weapon's simplicity allowed for creativity, and that creativity translated into survival. Terrain imposed new demands with every mile. In open fields, mortar teams relied on range and dispersion. In forests, they compensated for obscured sightlines with tighter coordination and rapid adjustment. In cities, the challenge was confinement, balancing blast effects against proximity to friendly troops. Each environment reshaped how the weapon was used, and each demanded speed and learning that left little room for error. Mortars also became central to combined arms warfare. Infantry advanced under their cover. Tanks relied on them to suppress threats beyond their guns' elevation. Artillery units coordinated barrages with mortar fire to create layered suppression. The mortar bridged gaps between units, operating at the seam where precision ended and mass fire began. This versatility distinguished the mortar from the rifle it increasingly overshadowed. Rifles excelled at direct engagement, but little else. Mortars countered enemy artillery by forcing batteries to displace. They softened defensive positions before assaults. They disrupted ambushes before they closed. One weapon, many purposes, all delivered without direct exposure. Mobility remained essential. Mortar teams learned to fire and move before counter-battery fire could respond. Positions were temporary, sometimes lasting only minutes. Crews carried tubes, base plates, and ammunition through mud, rubble, and snow, understanding that stillness invited destruction. Their effectiveness depended not just on accuracy, but on constant motion. German forces adapted as well, but their methods struggled to keep pace. Defensive systems built on fixed positions were repeatedly undermined by weapons that refused to remain fixed. Each countermeasure was met with another adjustment, another repositioning, another angle of attack. By the final months of the war, American mortar warfare bore little resemblance to its early form. What began as support fire had evolved into a central battlefield instrument, refined through experience rather than design. The mortar was no longer merely carried by the infantry, it shaped how the infantry fought. And as victory approached, one realization lingered beneath the celebration. The lessons learned in adaptation would not end with this war, but would follow soldiers into conflicts yet unseen. German defensive doctrine was built on preparation. Positions were surveyed, reinforced, and layered in depth. Trenches connected strong points. Machine guns were sighted to interlock. Artillery was registered in advance. The rifleman, supported by heavier weapons, was expected to hold ground through discipline and endurance. Against frontal assaults, this system had proven formidable. It was designed to absorb pressure, not evade it. Mortars attacked that logic from an unexpected direction. Their fire did not test the strength of defenses directly. It bypassed them. Shells descended into trenches, command posts, and rearward communication routes, the very spaces meant to sustain resistance. Positions that could withstand hours of rifle and machine gun fire were compromised in minutes once mortar rounds began to fall with accuracy and persistence. This exposed a widening artillery gap. German guns were powerful, but they were heavier, slower to redeploy, and dependent on centralized control. American mortars, by contrast, belonged to the infantry itself. They could be repositioned rapidly, adjusted immediately, and employed wherever resistance appeared. Fire support no longer waited for orders from the rear. It arrived with the assault. As Allied forces advanced, German strongpoints disappeared from maps one by one. Some were destroyed outright. Others were rendered untenable as mortar fire collapsed trenches and severed communications. Units withdrew not because they were overrun, but because their positions no longer functioned. To remain was to accept steady attrition without the means to respond. German commanders attempted to adapt. Counter-mortar tactics were introduced. Artillery concentrations were shifted to suppress likely firing areas. In some sectors, additional guns were committed in hopes of restoring balance, but mobility favored the attacker. Mortar teams moved before fire could be returned. Positions changed. Angles shifted. Precision remained. The struggle became one of control rather than territory. Mortars denied the Germans the ability to organize coherent defense. Even when lines held temporarily, they did so under constant pressure, eroded by indirect fire that arrived without warning and departed before retaliation could be mounted. Defense became reactive, provisional, and exhausting. Over time, the effects extended beyond casualties. German soldiers learned that depth no longer guaranteed safety. There were no quiet zones, no rear areas untouched by fire. Rest became fragmented. Command degraded. Confidence in fortifications, once a psychological anchor, gave way to resignation. This was the true impact of mortar warfare. It did not merely break defenses, it dissolved the assumptions behind them. Positions designed to endure were forced to move. Armies built for holding ground found themselves retreating through it instead. By the final months of the war, German defenses were no longer shaped by design, but by necessity. Mortars had helped make permanence impossible. And as the front continued to collapse, the question was no longer whether these weapons could defeat fixed defenses, but what kind of war would follow once no place could truly be held. Among the many fears soldiers carried into battle, few were as corrosive as uncertainty. Mortars embodied it completely. There was no muzzle flash to track, no advancing line to resist. A shell might land 20 yards away or directly overhead. The waiting was constant, and the waiting was worse than the impact. German soldiers spoke of listening not for explosions, but for silence, knowing that the next sound might be the last. Unlike rifle fire, mortar bombardment offered no predictable rhythm. Bullets cracked and snapped along familiar paths. Men learned when to move, when to stay still. Mortars disrupted that instinct. A distant thump, a pause, then detonation. Sometimes nothing followed. Sometimes everything did. Defensive positions that once provided reassurance became chambers of anticipation, each second stretching longer than the last. Over time, this uncertainty eroded morale. German units entrenched for days under intermittent mortar fire experienced exhaustion that sleep could not repair. Even when shells did not fall, their possibility shaped behavior. Movement slowed. Decisions were delayed. Men hugged cover long after danger had passed, unsure whether safety was real or temporary. The weapon worked even when it was not firing. Indirect fire granted American forces a decisive psychological advantage. Mortar teams could attack without exposing themselves, applying pressure without confrontation. German defenders, unable to identify the source, could not retaliate meaningfully. Fire was returned blindly or not at all. This imbalance fostered helplessness, a sense that the battle was being shaped elsewhere, beyond reach. The most unsettling aspect was invisibility. Death arrived without warning and without a face. Soldiers could not attribute danger to a figure across a field or a weapon at the end of a barrel. Instead, it seemed to descend from the sky itself. In this environment, courage became difficult to define. There was nothing to charge, nothing to outshoot, only something to endure. Leadership suffered accordingly. Officers tasked with maintaining cohesion under mortar fire often found their authority limited by circumstances they could not control. Orders were drowned out by explosions. Formations dissolved as men sought cover instinctively. Even disciplined units struggled to preserve structure when every movement risked drawing fire. Panic, once rare, became contagious. These effects compounded over time. Positions held by exhausted soldiers became brittle. Resistance weakened not because men lacked skill, but because they lacked certainty. The constant bombardment blurred the line between danger and anticipation, making rest impossible and confidence fleeting. Mortars did more than kill. They reshaped the emotional landscape of the battlefield. They drained resolve quietly, steadily, without spectacle. By the time assaults came, many defenders were already diminished, not in numbers, but in spirit. This was their true power. Long after the shells stopped falling, the fear they introduced lingered. And as the war moved toward its conclusion, it became clear that victory was no longer decided solely by who could fire straighter, but by who could endure less. When the Second World War ended, the mortar did not fade into obsolescence. It endured, carried forward, not as a relic of a particular conflict, but as a lesson written into doctrine. American forces emerging from the war understood that mobility, adaptability, and indirect fire had become permanent requirements of modern combat. In the decades that followed, mortars remained embedded in ground units, shaping how wars would be fought far from the beaches of Normandy. In Korea, rugged terrain and shifting front lines again favored weapons that could move with the infantry. Mortars provided immediate fire support in mountains where artillery could not follow and air power could not always reach. In Vietnam, dense jungles and dispersed engagements reinforced the same truth. Mortars, light enough to be carried through difficult terrain, delivered firepower without exposing positions, continuing the wartime pattern established in Europe. Technology refined what experience had proven. Post-war mortars gained greater range, improved accuracy, and increased lethality. Fire control systems replaced manual calculations. Communication improved. What had once depended on intuition and rapid estimation became increasingly precise. The arc of the shell remained the same, but the certainty of its arrival did not. New technologies accelerated this transformation. Guided munitions, advanced fuses, and improved targeting systems allowed mortars to strike with unprecedented accuracy. Forward observers equipped with modern sensors could adjust fire in near real time. Indirect fire became both flexible and discriminating, capable of engaging targets once considered beyond its reach. In this evolution, mortars influenced the rise of tactical artillery, a philosophy that valued responsiveness over mass. Heavy guns still mattered, but they no longer defined the pace of battle. Firepower had to move as fast as the units it supported. Mortars embodied that principle, bridging the gap between infantry weapons and larger systems, delivering force precisely where and when it was needed. Training and doctrine followed. Mortar employment became a foundational skill rather than a specialized one. Soldiers learned to integrate indirect fire into every phase of operations, from advance to defense to stabilization missions. The weapon was no longer supplementary, it was expected. In modern armies, mortars remain indispensable. They support urban operations where lines of sight are limited. They provide deterrence in peacekeeping missions where escalation must be controlled. They adapt to environments that change faster than plans can be written. Their relevance endures because their logic endured. Yet this legacy carries moral weight. Mortar warfare reflects a broader transformation in combat, a movement away from personal confrontation toward distance and abstraction. The rifle once symbolized individual responsibility. The mortar represents collective effect, delivered unseen. Efficiency has replaced intimacy. What began as an underestimated weapon became a model for how wars are now fought. And as technology continues to advance, the question left behind is not whether mortars will remain effective, but how far modern conflict has traveled from the human figures who once stood face to face across a battlefield. The rifle endured to the very end of the war, not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol. It represented the individual soldier, the idea that wars were fought by men who advanced on foot, exposed to danger, relying on skill, nerve, and judgment. In every army, the rifle remained the first weapon issued and the last surrendered. Its presence carried moral weight, binding combat to the person who pulled the trigger. Yet the Second World War revealed the limits of that tradition. As battlefields expanded and defenses deepened, the rifle's strengths narrowed. Precision mattered less when enemies refused to present themselves. Courage mattered less when exposure meant immediate death. The rifle still demanded heroism, but heroism no longer guaranteed results. Mortars told a different story. They reflected a shift away from personal confrontation toward calculated effect. Their purpose was not to duel, but to dominate space. Indirect fire allowed armies to shape battle without requiring constant exposure. Efficiency replaced intimacy. Distance replaced visibility. The outcome mattered more than the method. This did not diminish the human element, it redefined it. Mortar crews operated under pressure, making rapid decisions with incomplete information. Infantry still advanced into danger, often guided by fire they could not see. The war did not become impersonal. It became distributed. Responsibility spread across teams rather than resting on individuals alone. Strategically, the impact was undeniable. Mortars gave armies options rifles could not. They broke stalemates. They neutralized defenses. They allowed smaller units to hold or take ground against superior numbers. In battles where rifles alone would have stalled, mortars created momentum. Victory increasingly depended on who could deliver effective fire without presenting a target. As the battlefield changed, indirect fire moved from support to centerpiece. Mortars shaped movement, dictated timing, and determined outcomes. Rifles followed the openings they created. This inversion marked a fundamental transformation in how wars were fought, one that would continue long after 1945. And yet, the rifle never lost its symbolic power. It remained the weapon carried into ruins, forests, and streets. It was still the instrument of final contact, the last safeguard when systems failed. In memory and myth, the rifle preserved the image of war as a test of individual resolve. Mortars, by contrast, left little room for myth. They were efficient, effective, and emotionally distant. They killed without ceremony. They won battles without faces. In doing so, they anticipated the future of warfare, a future increasingly defined by technology, coordination, and distance. The final comparison is not one of replacement, but of revelation. The rifle showed what soldiers were willing to endure. The mortar showed what modern war required. Together, they exposed a truth that would outlast the conflict, that success no longer belonged to the bravest alone, but to those who adapted fastest. What began as an underestimated weapon became a defining force. Mortars did not merely outperform rifles, they reoriented the battlefield itself. And in that shift, the Second World War quietly announced the end of one kind of war and the beginning of another one, where survival depended less on what a soldier could see and more on what he could never see coming. The rise of the mortar was not an isolated development. It was part of a broader transformation in warfare, one driven less by valor and more by engineering. As the 20th century advanced, armies confronted problems that courage alone could not solve: fortified positions, dispersed forces, and battles fought across terrain too complex for linear tactics. Technology became the answer, and the mortar was among its most revealing expressions. This shift was visible across the battlefield. Radios replaced runners, mechanization reshaped movement. Firepower was no longer concentrated in a few massive guns, but distributed across units. Mortars fit this new logic precisely. They were not designed to dominate through weight, but through presence appearing wherever resistance emerged, then vanishing before it could be answered. In doing so, they altered how commanders thought about space and time in combat. Artillery itself was reimagined. Traditionally, it had been an arm of mass, slow to deploy and devastating when concentrated. Mortars represented a different philosophy. Portability mattered more than size. Speed mattered more than volume. Precision mattered more than spectacle. Fire support moved forward, embedded with those who needed it most, rather than waiting for permission from the rear. For the Allies, especially American forces, this approach proved indispensable. Mortar tactics were refined through constant use, adjusted to terrain and circumstance, with a flexibility that heavier systems could not match. What began as support became an expectation. Infantry planned movements, assuming mortar coverage would follow. Operations were shaped around their availability. The weapon became not an accessory, but a cornerstone. The war ended, but the logic endured. In Korea, mortars again proved their worth in mountainous terrain and fluid front lines. In Vietnam, they adapted to jungles and dispersed engagements, providing firepower where visibility and access were limited. Each conflict reaffirmed the same principle. Wars were no longer won by static power alone, but by systems that could adapt faster than the enemy. Yet, this evolution carried moral consequences. Mortars embodied a growing distance between the act of killing and the person who carried it out. Combat became increasingly abstract. Decisions were made by calculation rather than confrontation. Efficiency replaced intimacy. The battlefield grew quieter in one sense, even as it became more lethal in another. This raised uncomfortable questions. As weapons improved, the human cost did not diminish. It became easier to impose. The mortar did not ask its crew to see the enemy, only to trust coordinates. Responsibility became shared, diffused across systems and processes. The personal face of combat, once inseparable from the rifle, receded. In this sense, mortars symbolized more than tactical innovation. They marked a turning point in the moral architecture of war. Conflict became industrialized not only in production, but in execution. Victory depended less on individual action and more on integration, technology, and efficiency. The revolution was silent because it lacked drama. There were no grand unveilings, no singular moments of recognition. Mortars simply worked, and in working, they reshaped everything around them. By the end of the Second World War, one truth was clear. The future of warfare would belong to weapons that minimized exposure while maximizing effect. Mortars did not announce this future, but they revealed it. And in doing so, they quietly carried war away from the age of the rifle into an era defined by distance precision, and relentless adaptation. Military innovation is often measured in lives saved on one side of the line. Mortars undeniably reduced American casualties, allowing infantry to advance without exposing themselves to direct fire. Yet every advantage carries a shadow. The same efficiency that preserved one life ended another, often without warning or recognition. German soldiers killed by mortar fire rarely saw their enemy. Many never understood what struck them. In that distance, moral certainty became harder to define. As warfare modernized, it also became more detached. Mortars accelerated a trend already underway: combat conducted through systems rather than encounters. The rifle demanded presence. The mortar required calculation. Coordinates replaced faces. Violence became procedural, its consequences separated from the act itself. Soldiers followed orders, adjusted angles, and moved on, often without knowing who had been caught beneath the falling shells. This detachment carried its own psychological weight. American mortar crews were not immune to strain. Firing again and again, sometimes for hours, they understood the destructive power they commanded, yet they rarely saw the results. There were no bodies to confirm success, no surrendering enemy to validate purpose. Only the knowledge that somewhere beyond the tree line, men were dying because the calculations were correct. For some, this distance offered relief. For others, it introduced a quieter burden. Veterans later recalled moments of reflection, wondering who had been on the receiving end, whether the fire had been necessary, whether the unseen cost lingered longer than the tactical gain. The absence of immediacy did not erase responsibility. It delayed it. Ethical questions followed the weapon long after the fighting ended. Mortars forced a reconsideration of how far innovation should go in making killing easier and safer for the user. Each improvement reduced risk for one side while increasing vulnerability for the other. The balance between necessity and humanity narrowed. Victory became cleaner in execution but heavier in implication. The cost of that efficiency was written across the landscape: villages shattered by indirect fire, forests cratered beyond recognition, defensive lines erased without engagement. Mortars did not discriminate between courage and caution. They punished presence itself. In doing so, they revealed the true price of modern war, not just in lives lost, but in the erosion of older ideas about honor and confrontation. For veterans who survived, mortars remained vivid in memory, not as heroic instruments, but as constant presences. The sound of outgoing fire, the wait for confirmation, the silence afterward. Some remembered them as saviors, others as reminders of how impersonal the conflict had become. Few spoke of them lightly. War has always demanded compromise between morality and survival. Mortars sharpened that tension. They represented progress measured in efficiency, not restraint. They shortened battles and extended consequences. They helped end a war while ensuring that future conflicts would follow the same path. In the end, the human cost of mortar warfare cannot be calculated in numbers alone. It rests in the distance it created between enemy and enemy, between action and outcome, between necessity and reflection. The weapon worked exactly as intended. They built it to kill efficiently. It changed the way wars were fought forever. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, war no longer resembled the conflict that had begun 6 years earlier. The transformation was not defined by a single invention or decisive moment, but by a quiet accumulation of changes. Among them, mortars stood out not for their spectacle, but for their effect. They altered how battles were planned, how soldiers moved, and how victory was achieved. Indirect fire, once supplementary, had become dominant. This shift marked the arrival of a new age of warfare. Mortars were never glamorous. They lacked the symbolism of the rifle or the awe inspired by heavy artillery and aircraft. Yet they solved problems that bravery alone could not. They reached enemies who could not be seen. They punished defenses designed to endure. They gave commanders flexibility in landscapes that defied traditional solutions. In doing so, they redefined what effectiveness looked like on the battlefield. The role of technology became unmistakable. Mortars demonstrated that innovation did not need to be complex to be transformative. A simple tube, a base plate, and a system of calculation proved more influential than many elaborate weapons. Their success reinforced a growing truth of modern war. Outcomes would increasingly depend on tools that multiplied human effort rather than glorified it. World War II ensured that this lesson would not be forgotten. In the conflicts that followed, Korea's mountains, Vietnam's jungles, and countless engagements beyond mortars remained present. Their form evolved, their precision improved, but their purpose endured. They were carried forward as a proven answer to uncertainty, terrain, and resistance. Yet embedded within this legacy is a paradox. Mortars were designed to be efficient, to reduce exposure, to save lives on one side of the line. At the same time, they widened the gap between action and consequence. Soldiers who fired them rarely saw the enemy. Violence became something delivered, not confronted. The battlefield grew quieter in some ways, even as its reach expanded. This disconnect reflected a broader transformation. The Second World War was an industrial conflict, fought by systems as much as by individuals. Mortars fit naturally into that structure. They represented a war where machines extended human will, where coordination replaced confrontation, and where success depended less on what a soldier could see than on what could be calculated. The rifle did not disappear. It remained in the hands of infantry, present in the final moments of contact, but its dominance faded. Mortars killed more, suppressed more, and shaped more decisions. They operated in the background, unseen and often unacknowledged, yet decisive. Their influence was structural rather than symbolic. In this sense, mortars were never just weapons. They were signals, indicators of where warfare was headed. They pointed toward a future defined by distance, efficiency, and abstraction. A future where survival depended on adaptation rather than tradition, and where the most influential tools were often the least celebrated. The unseen legacy of mortar warfare lies not only in its continued use, but in the mindset it normalized. War became something managed as much as fought. The human figure remained central, but increasingly mediated by technology. Courage endured, but it shared space with calculation. Mortars may have killed more than rifles. They may have decided battles that bravery alone could not. But their greatest impact was neither tactical nor numerical. It was philosophical. They helped end one kind of war while ushering in another. They were built to arc unseen through the air. Their influence has done the same, quietly reshaping combat long after the echoes faded. The rifle has always carried meaning beyond its function. It is held, aimed, and fired by an individual, and in that act, responsibility is unmistakable. The soldier sees what he faces. He advances, retreats, or holds his ground by choice as much as by order. For generations, this intimacy defined combat and shaped how societies understood courage, sacrifice, and accountability. Mortars challenged that understanding. They did not replace the rifle, but they reframed its importance. Where rifles represented personal action, mortars embodied collective effort. A team calculated, fired, and displaced. The effect was distant, the result often unseen. Killing became a function of coordination rather than confrontation. The battlefield shifted accordingly. This change did not occur in isolation. Mortars emerged alongside tanks, aircraft, and mechanized artillery, all pointing toward a future where machines extended human reach. Tasks once accomplished through physical presence were now achieved through systems. Firepower was delivered without exposure. Success depended less on who advanced farthest and more on who integrated technology most effectively. For the soldier, this transformation altered the nature of participation. The rifleman remained essential, but his role increasingly depended on forces beyond his immediate control. Mortar fire shaped his movements. Armor protected his advance. Artillery cleared his path. His experience of combat became mediated, embedded within a larger structure that reduced individual agency while increasing collective efficiency. This tension lies at the heart of the continuing debate. Tradition argues that war, however brutal, must remain human in its execution, that responsibility should not be diluted by distance or machinery. Technology argues that survival demands adaptation, and that minimizing exposure is not moral failure, but necessity. Both positions carry weight. Both have shaped military evolution. The Second World War offered a decisive case study. Mortars proved that innovation could overcome entrenched defenses and alter strategic outcomes. They shortened battles and preserved lives on one side of the line. Yet they also introduced a form of violence that felt detached, procedural, and difficult to reconcile with older ideals of honor. The legacy of the mortar rests in that contradiction. It demonstrated the undeniable effectiveness of technological solutions while revealing their ethical cost. As mortars spread across armies worldwide, they normalized a way of fighting that prioritized efficiency over immediacy. War became something managed by systems rather than experienced solely by individuals. This debate did not end in 1945. It continues in modern conflicts, where precision-guided weapons and remote systems push distance even further. The questions first sharpened by mortars now extend to drones, sensors, and automation. How much separation is too much? At what point does efficiency undermine accountability? Mortars were among the first weapons to force this reckoning on a large scale. They did not remove the soldier from war, but they changed how the soldier related to it. The rifle remained in his hands, but the battlefield increasingly belonged to forces he could not see. In the end, neither technology nor tradition emerged victorious. War absorbed both. Rifles continued to symbolize personal sacrifice. Mortars defined modern effectiveness. Together, they reflected a conflict caught between past and future, between human presence and mechanical reach. The debate persists because it has no final answer. Each generation inherits it, shaped by new tools and new wars. But the lesson of the mortar endures. Innovation will always be met with skepticism until its results can no longer be ignored. They laughed at it once, they never laughed again. In the end, every discussion of weapons returns to the same truth. Wars are not fought by steel or powder, but by people. Rifles and mortars were carried, loaded, aimed, and fired by men, many barely older than boys, who lived with fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. Each day they survived. Whatever tool they held, it was their endurance that sustained the war effort, and their absence that marked its cost. Mortars, like rifles, were instruments rather than intentions. They did not choose targets, nor did they weigh consequences. They served the purpose demanded of them: to break resistance, to shorten engagements, to end a war that had already consumed millions. In doing so, they contributed to immense suffering. Entire units were erased without contact. Lives ended without confrontation. These outcomes were not aberrations. They were the result of efficiency applied to violence. That efficiency raises questions that cannot be answered by victory alone. Mortars demonstrated how technology could tilt the balance of war decisively, but also how easily distance could dull moral clarity. When killing is calculated rather than witnessed, responsibility becomes abstract. Success is measured in terrain gained and casualties inflicted, not in faces remembered. Yet, it would be dishonest to isolate mortars from the context that produced them. The Second World War was a struggle defined by scale and urgency. The enemy was entrenched, industrialized, and relentless. Innovation was not optional. It was required. Mortars saved lives by reducing exposure. They allowed advances that rifles alone could not achieve. In this sense, they were not symbols of excess, but of adaptation. Still, their legacy extends beyond tactical success. Mortars became part of a broader shift in warfare, one that continues today, where technology increasingly mediates human conflict. Each advance promises protection and precision, yet risks further separating action from consequence. The battlefield grows larger, the distance grows greater, the decisions grow quieter. The future of warfare will continue along this path. New systems will replace old ones, just as mortars once overshadowed rifles. Each innovation will claim necessity. Each will carry its own moral burden. The lessons of World War II remain relevant not because the weapons endure, but because the questions do. At the center of those questions stands the human face of technology. Mortars were effective, but they also remind us that progress in war often arrives without celebration. It comes measured in silence after bombardment, in ground taken at great cost, in veterans who carried memories they rarely shared. Victory, when it arrived, did not erase those experiences. It only ended their repetition. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: mortars killed more German soldiers than rifles, but they did not make war less tragic. They made it faster, more decisive, and more distant. Glory did not follow them. Only results did. And results, however necessary, come with a price that history must acknowledge. As the war recedes further into memory, it is tempting to focus on innovation alone to chart how tactics evolved and which weapons proved superior. But remembrance demands more. It requires honoring those who fought, regardless of the tools they carried, and recognizing that every advance in warfare reshapes not only how wars are won, but how humanity bears their weight. They built it to win a battle. It ended up rewriting history.